The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, and the subsequent battles for Normandy are one of the most famous aspects of World War II. So today, I want to dive into how the Allies won in Western France. This video will not be a true straightforward telling though. I will be fully focusing on the factors that dictated the battle in Normandy, and not the other sectors of France, like for Operation Dragoon, or on the Eastern Front. To be specific, I will be focusing on 3 distinct factors that I believe decided the outcome of Operation Overlord. These 3 factors mutually support each other in interesting ways, and they are air supremacy. Throughout the battle for France, the Allied air attacks devastate all German movements. Number 2, strategic realities. The strategic situation the German armies of France were forced into by the Allies doomed any possibility of a German victory. And number 3, logistics. Men fight and win battles, but logistics win wars. The Allies utilized superior logistic lines to break the German war machine in France. Now that you know the 3 factors I'll be focusing on throughout the battle for France, I want you to keep them in mind as I tell this story of D-Day and the battle for Normandy. In the lead up to the Normandy invasion in the spring of 1944, the Allies knew that without control of the air, their invasion force would be vulnerable to discovery and destruction. Because of that necessity, they went on a concentrated plan to destroy the Luftwaffe's capabilities. They pounded German oil installations, aircraft production centers, and, with the new long-range P-51 Mustangs, actively engaged and destroyed the Luftwaffe's fighter force. For context, in March of 1944, German oil production was at 316,000 tons per month. By September, that number was down to only 17,000 tons per month. As well, attacks during 1944 reduced aviation gas supplies from 175,000 tons in April to 30,000 tons in June, and then even further to 5,000 tons by September. The Luftwaffe was down to its last reserves, effectively grounding what fighters they had left that were not destroyed. The bombing campaign against oil was so effective that the Germans had 815 fighters available to fly on D-Day, but only flew 100 sorties due to a lack of oil. Rail lines were also targeted, and by the end of December, the number of rail wagons available weekly had fallen from the normal total of 900,000 to only 214,000. The French resistance helped Allied air units in this victory. They constantly destroyed rail lines in France. That destruction made resupply of the German armies in Normandy extremely fragile. The Allied campaign in the air made an especially brutal impact on aircraft production. In 1944, the Germans had managed to produce 39,000 planes, but their target goal was to produce 80,000. Meanwhile, the Americans and British combined to produce over 100,000 aircraft in the same year. By June of 1944, the Allies had won the air war and could take advantage of complete air supremacy over northwest France. That power would devastate German logistics and strategic capabilities throughout the upcoming battles. So, the Allied plans for D-Day are pretty well known. US, British, and Canadian forces would land at 5 different beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Before those landings, in the early morning hours, British and American paratroop forces would be dropped behind enemy lines to take key objectives. The British 6th Airborne's goal was to take the bridges around the Orne River to prevent any German armored counterattack from the east from reaching the beaches. On the American side, the 82nd would land near Utah Beach and take the key town of St. Mary Église, while the 101st would land south of Utah Beach and aim to take the town of Carentan. Those 2 towns were needed to link up the American landing forces on Utah and Omaha beaches to help facilitate the drive inland. The primary focus on the Allied side was gaining a foothold in Normandy. They had loose objectives on how far they wanted to be in the first 24 hours. But as long as they had a foothold, Eisenhower and company knew they could make the breakout from there. Logistics support was at the top of their thinking. They designed artificial ports called mulberries to help the flow of supplies as their forces broke out from the beachheads. To further show the importance of logistics and Allied planning, the first move by the American forces after attaining a beachhead would be to hook west towards Cherbourg to take that key port. That port was hoped to help the eventual push towards Paris by bringing in tons of supplies and men through there. Why didn't the Allies just land at a port like Cherbourg at the beginning and take it immediately? Well, that's easy. They tried that once, in what was infamously called the Dieppe Raid. In August of 1942, Canadian forces were landed in an amphibious direct assault on the port of Dieppe in northern France. They were crushed though, and after that, it was clear to military leaders attempting a direct assault on a heavily defended port was impossible, and so the Allies needed to create a beachhead before taking the port. Now what about the German side? How did they plan to stop this invasion? Hitler and his generals were determined not to let the Allies get a foothold. But first, they had to figure out where the invasion would land. They had roughly 2,000 miles of coast to worry about, and so they looked everywhere, including Spain, Portugal, Norway, and Denmark. And in France specifically, both the Mediterranean coast and the Bay of Biscay were considered as possible locations. However, they knew the most likely area would be in range of Allied air bases, which were located in southern and eastern England. This meant that the coast of Holland all the way down to the Channel towards Cherbourg was the primary region of concern for them. In that range, the most obvious target was Pas-de-Calais. It was located the shortest distance from England and would be an ideal spot for close air support. As well, it offered a direct line of advance to the German frontier and would eliminate German V-1 rocket locations, which were soon to be ready to start launching. This is why the main defenses on the Atlantic Wall were from Dunkirk to the Somme estuary. The second most likely spot was Normandy, and the Germans knew this too, and added defenses there as well. Hitler was determined not to lose an inch of ground to the Allies, and wanted any Allied landing to be immediately crushed. Their thinking was logical. Those were the two spots the Allies considered for their invasion force. They chose Normandy over Pas-de-Calais because they figured Normandy would have lighter defenses, and after all, their main goal was just to get a beachhead in France. They were correct in avoiding Pas-de-Calais, because like I said, the Germans had fortified this region the strongest. The Allies would then embark on the greatest coordinated misinformation plan ever. The Allies needed to convince the German leaders the invasion force was destined for Pas-de-Calais. They did so by creating a fake army at Kent in England called the 1st US Army, which utilized inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic to make it seem like the Allies were massing an army just across the channel from Pas-de-Calais. As well, the Allies effectively used double agents to send back reports from England that the invasion would happen at Pas-de-Calais. These measures, as well as an aerial bombing of the area around Pas-de-Calais, convinced Hitler and several German commanders that the main invasion force was going to hit Pas-de-Calais. This intelligence victory would be pivotal to the success of Operation Neptune. Meanwhile, how to approach the Allied invasion led to disagreements among the German high command. Rommel, who was in command of the forces in the suspected invasion region from Holland to Loire, was convinced the panzer units should be deployed close to the beaches to defeat the Allies as they landed. However, led by Rundstedt, who was in overall command of all German forces in France, and supported by both Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of the Panzer Troops, and Geyer, who commanded all the armored units in the west, they disagreed with Rommel. They wanted a flexible defense in depth, which would put the panzers in the forest just north of Paris, ready to counterattack once the Allied landing location was revealed on invasion day. Rommel, though, had grown to greatly respect Allied air power after fighting in North Africa. He was convinced that because the Allies had total air supremacy in northwest France, they would never allow a counterattacking force to reach the battle in time to ensure a decisive result. This was absolutely critical in his mind, because in his estimation, if the Allies achieved even a foothold in Normandy, the German forces would never be able to dislodge them, and all of France would eventually be lost. Stopping the Allied invasion on the beaches on invasion day was his goal. Hitler responded to this disagreement with a bad compromise. The panzers would be split, some being held close to the beaches to stop the invasion force, while the rest were held in reserve as a counter-attacking force. And neither Geyer, Rommel, or even Rundstedt would be in charge of these panzers. Only Hitler would have the full authority to authorize their movement. Ultimately, Rommel had a very valid point. because on D-Day, the Allied air power did devastate the planned German counterattacks. For starters, they bombed towns like Caen and St. Lo, which were key transportation hubs the German tanks would have to pass through. Because of the bombings, the roads were clogged with debris, and the German counterattack was severely delayed. To showcase just how much of a mess air attacks and the French resistance made on transportation, it took the Dice Reich SS Panzer Division, considered an elite counterattacking force, 2 weeks to go a distance that should have taken them 3 days. As well, 2 more examples of Allied air power ruining the armored counterattack are: 1. In the area of Caen, a German panzer group attempted to push the British off their beaches, but were hit in the open roads by fighter-bomber attacks, which reduced their forces from 104 to only 60 vehicles by late afternoon. And 2. Once the Panzer Lehr Division, which was the German panzer counterattack coming from the Paris region, had finally been ordered to make all speed for the coast, they were bombed in their assembly area. They had a mighty struggle throughout June 6th trying to move in the open daylight hours because of fighter-bomber attacks. No armored counterattack would be able to generate enough momentum against the weight of Allied air power, giving the British, American, and Canadian forces enough time to establish beachheads. As everyone already knows, the Allied landing forces were successful in establishing footholds on all 5 beaches. Some were easier than others. Omaha Beach was in particular a tough obstacle, and overall they didn't reach the objective line they had hoped for, but beachheads were the main goal. In their initial landings, they were aided significantly by their intelligence victory. The Panzer counterattacking force was delayed moving because Hitler was asleep when the landings first made ground. But even when he woke up, he delayed sending them to Normandy because he was convinced the main attack would be at Pas de Calais. That delay was huge for Allied success. As well, the French resistance did a great job of cutting telephone wires, which caused German commanders in different sectors to be out of communication with each other. What communication they were capable of had to be done by radio, and because the Allies had Ultra, they decrypted all of these German radio messages. The Germans were so caught off guard by the landings, key commanders like Rommel weren't even in the area when it started. Now with the beachheads firmly established, the German army would be doomed in the battle for Normandy, and subsequently France. Over the next 2 months, the German army in France would be slowly ground down until it finally collapsed under Allied pressure. Nothing is inevitable in history, but with the success of the Normandy landings, the position the German forces found themselves in was severely limited because of the 3 factors I mentioned at the beginning of the video. For starters, any counterattack they attempted was doomed before it even could get started. Allied air power made sure of that. Without the ability to launch a counterattack, the German army could not drive the Allies into the sea or counter any Allied advances. Basically, they were stuck in static positions being slowly bled out. Why couldn't they launch a counterattack? Well, for one, the Germans had no capacity to mass their armored units, without the dust and smoke being seen by spotter or fighter planes patrolling overhead. Once spotted, the armored columns were strafed at will. Just moving to the staging area was perilous for German armor. Movement in the daylight hours was quickly spotted by the shield of Allied fighters patrolling overhead, leading to deadly attacks. It is hard to launch a massed counterattack when you take severe casualties before even getting to the launch point. That doesn't even take into account that once German offensives began, they were fighting an uneven battle. Fighting in Normandy meant the Allies could rely on support from their naval guns, on warships in the English Channel. So once a German counterattack began, the Allies would simply call upon their warships' big guns to essentially create a wall of artillery fire that stifled German panzers. Furthermore, German counterattacks couldn't rely on the Luftwaffe or artillery to support them by softening up the Allied lines before the attack began. Like I stated earlier, German aviation fuel levels were critically low at this point, preventing their fighters from consistently taking the air. As well, when German fighters or bombers did actually take off, the Allied fighter screen blocked any of those planes from getting through. While for artillery shells, they are so important to support an offensive. But German artillery ammunition supplies had to be severely rationed. Allied air attacks on the rail, road, and bridge transportation networks of France meant the steady flow of artillery shells to the battlefield units was impossible. That prevented the German guns from supporting their armored attacks. Here are a couple examples of how stressed the German Luftwaffe and artillery units were. For the Luftwaffe, throughout the Normandy campaign, the Allied fighter shield meant their aircraft were consistently intercepted as soon as they would take off, while bombers were forced to drop their loads long before they reached the target area due to the Allied fighters. Crew strength was also devastated. They had some aces, but most airmen were fresh out of flight school thrown into combat missions. One German pilot is recorded to have stated he regularly found himself chased by 8 to 10 Mustangs anytime he went on a mission. To top it all off, every known German airfield in the area was bombed and strafed by Allied air forces on a regular basis. Fighter squads were forced to deploy to the woods, close to a stretch of straight road, which could be used as a runway. When returning, they had to land, then immediately turn into the trees to hide. As for artillery, the supply issue was so bad that German artillery units in the British sector around Caen were rationed to only 3 shells a day. It would be impossible to hold off the Allied onslaught indefinitely with only 3 shells a day for artillery. Artillery and air power being firmly in the Allies' favor while being a complete non-factor for the German forces severely limited the strategic planning options for German commanders. Essentially, they had to stay in fixed defensive positions with minimal movement for fear of air attack. It is impossible to fight and win a battle when the opposing side can dictate the terms of battle so effectively and extensively. German strategy was further hampered by directives from above. After the defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler was obsessed with defending every inch of ground, refusing to give up anything, and so he was determined not to pull back from the Normandy sector even when his commanders insisted their armies were overexposed and at a breaking point. However, the German army in Normandy did have one advantage: terrain. Normandy has a tricky terrain to fight through due to the hedgerows. Those are thick bushes that crisscross the Norman countryside and could easily be used to conceal German gun emplacements, panzers, and fighting positions. This forced the Allies into a methodical advance, slowly pushing through those tough positions one after another. However tough those positions were to take, they didn't change the strategic makeup of the battle for Normandy. The German army in the west was overextended on a front roughly 50 miles long. They couldn't launch counterattacks, and they couldn't supply or reinforce their army in the field. So they were stuck in a grinding war of attrition without any realistic prospect of reversing the situation. The Allies, on the other hand, had none of the logistic issues on the same level as the German army. They could consistently count on the flow of supplies and reinforcements from bases in England across the English Channel. The Luftwaffe and the German Navy were never able to implement any effective resistance to this flow. That's why the Allies could keep hitting the Germans on a broad front, slowly grinding down their manpower. Even the June storm that destroyed the American Mulberry at Omaha Beach and severely damaged the other British one, the supply flow was still not critically hurt. Americans found a way to land more supplies through the beaches than anywhere, no matter the obstacles. To showcase the American logistical might, here are some important stats. Cherbourg was supposed to be the key port needed to supply the armies in France. Without it, there were concerns the advance could not be supported by the improvised supply stations on the beachheads. However, in August, for example, they landed 266,000 tons and 817 vehicles at Cherbourg, while at Omaha, Utah, they combined to land 351,000 tons and 9,000 vehicles. Allied ingenuity to keep their supply lines strong and flowing was something the German war machine just could not beat. Now, the Germans did have a weapon that might have been able to interdict the Allied supply lines, but it was not utilized effectively for military purposes. That was the V-1 rocket. Hitler refused to target the Allies' beaches or the ports in southern England, which were overcrowded with supply depots. Instead, all of the rockets would be launched at London. He was obsessed with this idea that somehow by constantly hitting London with rockets, he could make the British population give up on the war. and it had the exact opposite effect, strengthening their resolve instead. That meant that nothing would stop the steady flow of supplies for the Allied army's eventual breakout, from Normandy towards Paris and beyond. Hitler and his micromanagement is another aspect that devastated any realistic possibility of a military success. Like I stated earlier, he became obsessed with holding on to every blade of grass after Stalingrad. That mentality crippled German military commanders because it gave them very little flexibility. As a case in point, the German war machine poured massive amounts into Hitler's Atlantic Wall to defend all the points along the European coast. That left roughly 200,000 soldiers locked into defense, without being used in the battles west or east. They would simply be bypassed and isolated. The strategy that was left to German commanders was to pour their panzer divisions into the British sector around Caen, which was the most direct path to Paris, and so the most important sector in Hitler's eyes. And so the elite 2nd SS Panzer Division was sent to Caen, which would devastate several British advances south. However, that meant Germany's most mobile and powerful force was stuck on the inner flank, held in check, while the American forces could push west, towards Cherbourg for the port there, and eventually in late July a breakout south during Operation Cobra, towards Avranches, with the ultimate goal of taking Brest. At this point in the battle, a golden opportunity presented itself for Patton and his Third Army to swing east. Originally, they planned to just focus on Brittany, to take the ports there, which would help with their supply lines. But with how overstretched and fragile the German line was, the breakthrough in the west showcased a gap between the German army and the Loire. The German commanders had put everything into propping up their main defensive line, and so there was no depth to their defense. That meant there were no forces in a position to stop the American drive east towards Paris and an encirclement of the whole German army group west. Kluge, the German general in charge, after Hitler dismissed Rundstedt in late June because he believed that Rundstedt was not executing his orders energetically and was inflicted with defeatism, wanted to retreat to the Seine at this point. He could see how overexposed and vulnerable his defensive line was. But Hitler ordered him to hold his ground and prepare for a counterattack, to cut off the American force which had swung behind the main German line. Falling back was out of the question for Hitler. For one, the Seine is difficult to defend because of how winding the river is, but more importantly to Hitler, he does not want to lose access to resources from Spain and Portugal, or the U-boat bases on the Atlantic. Most importantly though, at this point the German army is not mechanized, and would have to retreat on foot, at the mercy of Allied air attacks. Once again, air supremacy is having a major effect on the strategic options available to the German army. This counterattack will lead to the doom of the German forces in Normandy. The German counterattack was at Mortagne on August 6th and was called Operation Lüttich. The goal was to cut off Patton's army south of Avranches. For the offensive, Hitler was seeing what he wanted to see. He looked at the divisions on the map and counted their theoretical strength, not their actual strength. As well, even if it was successful in the short term and they took the city, the German army had no ability to hold Avranches in the long term. German supply lines had hit the point of disaster from being overstretched and harassed by Allied air power. Now, their overburdened supply system is being asked to provide enough support for a counterattacking force at the far end of their line in the west. Then, to somehow maintain logistical support with that force, so it can somehow hold on to Avranches. They have no way to accomplish that. Simply put, at this stage in the battle for Normandy, just supplying their static army in the field is an almost impossible task. So trying to retake a new location at the far end of their front is just out of the question. This offensive is also a great example of why Allied air power ruined the German Army Group West. The offensive did achieve some initial surprise, but the Allies countered it effectively by calling in British Typhoon rocket-firing fighters, which had deadly effects. The Typhoons would come in on an attack run against a German column of panzers, and focus on the first and the last vehicle in the line, with the goal of clogging the road for the rest of the column to be picked off from there. And even when the Typhoons missed their targets, the rockets had such a terrifying effect, it was common for German tank crews to rush out of their vehicles and look for safety by the side of the road. To make matters worse, the Luftwaffe was supposed to be able to support this attack, but they couldn't make it through the Allied fighter screen. The attack was stalled on the key hills around Mortain. Allied spotter planes called in air and artillery to devastate all German movement in the area. To amplify the pain the Germans felt, they couldn't call in support from other sectors, because at this time, the Canadian Army was launching an attack that prevented the panzer units from leaving that sector. Germany had conquered Europe by winning a war of movement. Their panzers moved fast and created confusion, but now, without any proper air or artillery support, they were crushed in the open fields of France. In fact, the most effective weapon against Allied armor in Normandy wasn't even any particular German tank. It was the 88 gun, which could be easily concealed and did not require fuel, making it an ideal defensive weapon in the hedgerows of France. The feared German panzer units had become a logistical weight pulling down the inept German logistical supply system. Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer Mark IVs had no ability to be used effectively without support from air and artillery units. On August 9th, Patton continued his swing east, capturing the main German supply base at Alencon. The Germans now had nothing to protect their southern flank. The US Army can achieve this feat because their logistics create strategic opportunities unheard of to the German Army. A typical US armored division required 60,000 gallons of fuel a day, and while moving cross-country, that number jumps up to 125,000 gallons just to move 100 yards. That level of fuel usage can be sustained by fuel cables that were laid across the English Channel, which pump fuel from bases in England to France. As well, for every 21,000 men in France, it is required to provide 35 tons of rations per day, and the Allies are able to accomplish that. The German soldiers, on the other hand, are desperate for any food supplies. The Allied logistic machine is able to keep the flow of food, fuel, and munitions churning, creating the opportunity for Patton's famous breakout. The Germans in the retreat are forced to abandon vehicles, and what vehicles that are left need troops constantly watching for air attack. Air attacks were so constant they would even hit individual German vehicles traveling alone. Both Generals Rommel and Kluge were wounded in Normandy by Allied fighter attacks that hit their vehicles on empty roads. By August 16th, the German army was pushed into the Falaise Pocket, an area only 12 miles by 5 miles. In that pocket, Allied air and artillery obliterated everything that moved. German forces had to hide by day and move by night to do the best they could to escape. The Allies did miss an opportunity here to capture the whole Army Group West in that pocket, but even so, once the German army escaped the pocket, they had nowhere left in France to go to form up a new defensive line. Hitler had refused to fortify the Seine or prepare earlier for a contracted defense line, preferring to put everything he had into the Normandy sector. That meant the only place the German army could retreat to was basically to the Rhine and into the fatherland, leaving Paris wide open, which would be liberated after only brief skirmishes on August 19th, 1944, effectively ending the battle for France. In the Battle for Normandy, for 2 months, from June to August, the lines changed very little, and the German army resisted fiercely. But it was all setting up for their destruction. Because of their overextended line that was low on everything from food to fuel to munitions, and was constantly harassed by Allied air and artillery, the German Army Group West could only hold on to its line until it cracked. And once the line cracked, there was no way for them to stop the flood of the Allied advance. The three key factors of air supremacy, logistics, and strategic reality all fed into each other to make the German army in France doomed. With Allied air supremacy, they were able to keep their own supply trains flowing, while the German one was eviscerated. As well, any attempted counterattack by the famous German armored divisions could be spotted and punished before and during their offensives. On the logistics side, lack of flexibility to supply food, fuel, and munitions made the German forces stuck into static defensive positions, terrified of losing contact with what little supply access they had. Compare that with the Allies' plenty of all things vital, and you can see a situation where German resistance against the Allied breakout could only last so long. And both those factors fed into the strategic reality. Because Allied planes are blocking all movement, the Germans can't put together any effective counterattacks to the Allies' breakout. As well, the Germans don't have the supplies to support any offensive moves of their own. So that leaves them with very little options when it comes to military strategy. Basically, they are stuck in Normandy with only the ability to make the Allied advance as bloody as possible. But once they break through, there is no way for the German army to mount any resistance anywhere else in France. It ensures that Normandy will be the showdown for France, and it is a showdown heavily tilted in the Allies' favor. Now, would the German army have been better served pulling back out of western France and forming a new line on the Loire and Seine? Probably, but those same three issues would have come up. The Allies would have used French airfields to move their air forces close to that line, and would have continued to dominate the skies over France, since the air war had already been won before Normandy even started. Even that shorter German supply line would still have been at the mercy of Allied air attacks. As well, the lack of fuel was not going to get fixed by pulling back, which means German Army Group West would have still been stuck fighting a static defensive battle much like they did in Normandy. Honestly, once the Allies established beachheads, there was nothing left for the German army to do to hold on to France. You never want to say something is inevitable in history, but with those three factors so firmly in the Allies' advantage, winning the battle for France was out of the question for the German army. And because this video was meant to focus purely on the Normandy sector, I didn't even get to cover Russia's Operation Bagration, which caused a significant breakthrough in the east, or the Americans' follow-up Operation Dragoon, which landed another force along the Mediterranean coast that the German army would have to defend against. Ultimately, Germany tried to defend everywhere, and it spread them thin and weak everywhere. Victory in Normandy would mark the final push to end the Second World War.